Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Love Beach by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and that's because this is a very special episode because we have reached the halfway point! Woohoo! Oh yeah! Oh yeah! Uh-huh!
My name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So yeah, this is the halfway point of the series, and this is the exact halfway point. Because we have an odd number, we can actually pinpoint the exact half of this series, which means that half of this entire journey is behind us and half of it is still looming in the horizon. I want to thank everyone who's joined me and everyone who will join me in the future and is watching this video. You are all so great, so thank you very much. But anyway, here are some of my favorite bits from this album.
Love Beach, I'm gonna make love to you on Love Beach. Make all your dreams. I said I'm a gambler, there's no question of that. But I never gamble on a woman, and that's a matter of fact.
So welcome back my friends to the show that never ends. Well, this show will actually end on the 1st of January 2023, but okay, let's not get into that right now. But anyway, welcome everyone to a very special episode in which we're gonna be reviewing one of the worst progressive rock albums by a very successful progressive rock band ever. So Emerson, Lake and Palmer, ELP, you all know them, you probably all love them. They're one of the seminal progressive rock bands of all times. They've given us albums like Tarkus, Brain Salad, Surgery, Trilogy, even the live pictures at an exhibition, which to me all of them are absolute 100% perfection of albums. But unfortunately, ELP wouldn't see the same longevity as other 70s prog bands like Jethro Tull or Yes or Pink Floyd. These guys would release their first album in the year of 1970 and quickly disband in 1978. And despite coming back together in the 90s, and let's not even talk about the 80s, a time in which they made music that honestly nobody really asked for, they will always be remembered for their works back in the 70s. But you see, the trio's end wasn't a simple one like many. You see, these guys were actually contractually obligated back in 1978 when they already wanted to disband and each go his own way to give the record company just one more album under the ELP alias. So within their last few breaths, the three members have bounded together to create one last album that would cause hardcore ELP fans to question their loyalty to the band in the decades to come. And yes, now in hindsight we could all have seen this coming and seeing that an album that was basically pressured on to be made wouldn't be a successful album to begin with. Because it's not often that we see albums that were made unwillfully actually reach any noticeable success. And this album is just that case. Upon release it was bombarded by critics for being an absolutely awful album, and up until today we still see people rating this album lower than average. Like, looking for a rating that's more than 3 out of 5 stars on the Prog Archives is honestly harder than finding a 1-star rating for The Dark Side of the Moon. Now, while in theory this album sounds like it has no chance of success, I believe that this is the right moment where I'm gonna drop the bombshell on all of you, and I'm gonna go out of my conventions and tell you all that my rating for this this album will actually be a rating of 8 out of 10. Order! Order in the court! Please everyone be quiet and let me explain to you all why I think what I think, and maybe somehow I can get myself out of the peculiar situation that I got myself into. So let's break down this album for what it actually is. So side 1 of this album, as foretold by the cover and the name for this album, is basically an amalgamation of a few love songs. Now, as cliche as love songs might be, my expectations for how these were going to sound were basically so hideously basic that I was expecting the worst of the worst. But I was actually pretty dumbstruck when I realized that these songs were well realized and actually had some personality to them. And I think this is the point I should mention. I didn't suffer through any of these. None of them were bad songs in particular. I've heard way worse things on this list so far, which I gave like a mediocre rating to, and honestly these songs in their essence still sounded to me like ELP. And I think that this is the turning point for this album, the fact that this still sounds like the band we all know and love, and I really don't know how you can dispute that. Carl Palmer's drumming is just fantastic on this entire album. Maybe it's not as innovative as what it did back in their previous albums, but in all honesty, his drumming is kind of over the top, and in some places it even sounds like more than what's actually needed, and I actually like this quirky mismatching between the drumming and what the songs were actually about. And Greg Lake's voice still sounds fresher than ever. He still does his signature straining the voice to sound really, authentically emotional in some way, and I really like that, and he actually brings his soul into the music, and there's no way I couldn't appreciate that commitment he's bringing into this album. I could argue that Keith Emerson would be the weakest player on this album. He doesn't interject even close to half of what he used to do in their previous albums, but still he adds a lot to this, and it's kind of fun listening to him not really trying all that much. I don't know, maybe this isn't a masterpiece album, but it's definitely not something that I suffered listening through. And what I've just described to you are only a few of the songs found on side 1, because we actually have 2 other songs that aren't even love songs to begin with, which to me were the special gems on this first side. So firstly you have The Gambler, which might be somewhat basic, but honestly it tells a classic ELP short story, which is really nice, and maybe it wasn't done as good as the Alan Parsons Project did it, but honestly I kinda enjoyed that a lot, and it was my favorite track until I got later into this album. But my actual favorite track from side 1 has to be the instrumental piece called Canario. This one I really can't see how anyone would give a 1-star rating to. It isn't garbage, it's really fun, and it sounds like, although not quite up there with songs like Hoedown or Fanfare to the Common Man, being this really hyperactive song which is really fun, and an instrumental which is honestly a signature ELP track, which to me at least left me very surprised to see that they actually even try doing something like this on this album. But the reason I call this track my favorite from side 1 is because my favorite of the entire album actually resides on the side 2 of this album. The first time I've heard that this album actually has a 20-minute long suite on the second side, I was blown away by it even before I heard it. The last thing I would have expected this band with their contractual obligation to do was to create a big long epic to close this album off. But they did so, and I will be perfectly honest with you guys, I love this one to bits. I think my initial rating for it was like an 8, and then I listened to it again and it's a 9, and then I've been listening to it non-stop since then, and it's definitely a 10 out of 10 for me right now. God, for anyone watching this video and hating this album so much, this must sound blasphemous to you all. So Memories of an Officer and a Gentleman, which is the name of the 4-part suite that's found on the second side, to me is a lovely epic which I really like, that talks about a man and wartime. I really enjoyed how this one opens up with the first part of prologue, which gives us an introduction to everything that's going on, and to me it just sounded fantastic. It's like symphonic prog at its finest, combined with a bit of new age ideas, and I really like that. And then we get into part 2 of the suite, which actually sees Keith Emerson finally waking up from his coma and start doing real nice things on the piano. piano, which sound quite amazing and definitely is his high point for this album. Yes, I would agree, part 3 of this suite isn't as good as anything else that came before. After it, I think it's the lowest point on this entire suite, but it's quickly remedied by part 4 and the last of this suite. And this one really baffles me. I have no idea how could anyone not love the way that this song ends. This song ends literally the same way the Tarkus ends if it was combined with a song like Abaddon's Bolero. So you basically have this march going on with the drums and the keyboards, and it all just kind of builds upon itself and gets gradually more grandiose with more instruments and more sounds until it just fades off into the distance. I love listening to this entire suite just to get to this final piece of music, which is really just pleasure to my ears. So all in all, take away the love songs from side 1 and you're left with a pretty much close as you can get to perfect album to me. And what sometimes happens on this series is that I rate albums lower than what most people would consider these albums to be. But in this particular case, I think we've gotten ourselves into some sort of a mixed situation in which I'm gonna rate this album, well, I already told you the rating, higher than what most people would give it by a ton. And I wish not to argue with anyone about the rating of this album, but what I will say is that for anyone who might mindlessly hate this album, please go ahead and check it out and maybe you'll find something different in it. I went into this one with some sort of objectivity, although for years upon years now I've heard how bad this album is. I was expecting something so bad, but I was delighted to see that this album had a lot to offer, and it's not just me balancing out what I was expecting. I do wholeheartedly believe that this album is really fun to listen to, and I've replayed it many times now and I've had fun listening to it from start to finish multiple times. And if the main point of criticism people have towards this album is the basicness featured on side 1, well, you'd be correct, and this album might be worse than their other albums, maybe their previous albums, but when compared to everything that I've ever heard, and especially what I've heard this year, I can definitely tell you all that this album really isn't bad at all, and it's definitely one of the more enjoyable ones I've heard on this list so far. On the other hand, this is such a bad cover, like such a bad cover, so cringy. I get the fact that you had to make this album, but nobody forced you to make a cover like this, at least not that I'm aware. Maybe someone forced them to do that, but that would be kinda illegal with that, open shirt that Greg has. But who knows, I don't like this cover at all. And yes, I do wholeheartedly believe that this cover is a main reason why people hate this album so much. Again, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but sometimes when a cover looks like this, you just have to interject some judgment into it. But I do genuinely believe that if this album actually had a better looking cover and not such a damning backstory to it, many people who would have encountered it for the first time would have probably rated it higher than it is. So yeah, I already told you all my rating, but I'm gonna repeat it yet again. So my rating for this album would be a perfect 8 out of 10, might even be a 9 if I keep listening to this one the same rate I'm listening to it right now. It's a really fun album. I know it has the basic love songs on it, but honestly they're pretty good. I don't really know why people hate them so much, but yeah. That's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Crises by Mike Oldfield. I of course want to thank my lovely supporter over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wallen. You are the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow for a beginning of a new half. Bye, guys.